Hi, everyone. Welcome to Disrupting Biases in Hiring Practices. We're excited for you to join us today. As you are getting settled in, we have a couple check-in questions for you that I'm going to go ahead and drop in the chat. One of the questions, hopefully it doesn't incite any sort of fighting words, but I think it's a really good practice for us to start with. So my name is Dane. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am in marketing here at Agility. And I'm going to be kind of your tech support background kind of person here during this webinar. So as I said before, we'll drop some questions in the chat. Please go ahead and introduce yourself so we know who's here. So share your name, your pronouns, your title, and or your role in the hiring process. And then our bonus question, which is, I think some of you might know, this might incite a little bit of bias, is do you think pumpkin spice is overrated? So it is pumpkin spice season. It is fully going on. So feel free to engage with that question and just let us know who's here. I go back and forth on pumpkin spice myself. I really like the spicy scent of the candles, but I don't particularly like the drinks. So there we go. That's my answer. And then just for anyone who's joining us now, if you've ever come to our webinars, you should know by now, we do send out follow-up emails afterwards. So we're recording this webinar. We're going to send everything out later. You should get that tomorrow. So there'll be a recording and any other resources that we share. And then just some reminders, there's going to be some time for participation, but you can go ahead and just add any questions that you have to the chat and we'll do our best to answer them in real time. But if we don't, we'll go ahead and answer them during our Q&A session. There's another option. If you want to submit an anonymous question, you can select the Q&A box and you can submit your question anonymously that way as well. Oh, yep. Awesome. Thank you so much. We love this. Thank you all so much for engaging with us here in the chat and introducing yourselves. Love this. Fantastic. Thank you. Great. And just a few reminders, if you are joining us here, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. This will be recorded, so if you have to hop off, no worries. We will send you the recording afterwards, as well as any other resources that we share today. All right. Perfect. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to see you all here. We'll just give another moment for everyone to join us and introduce themselves. All right. See some people who've had their minds changed about pumpkin spice. Time and place. Love this. Love seeing these answers. Fantastic. Yes. We love that. We love being unapologetic about the things that we enjoy. We totally support that. All right, fantastic. I am going to go ahead and pass this off to our amazing hosts who are going to talk us through all of these things in hiring practices. And just if you need have any questions, need any support during the webinar, please feel free to message me directly. All right, Diane and Karina, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Thank you, Dane, and thank you everyone for introducing yourselves in the chat. My name is Diane Sellers. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a principal at Agility. I've been with Agility for a little over a year, and prior to joining, I was the Director of Recruitment and Selection for Baltimore City Public Schools. I've worked in education for 23 years. Started off as a teacher, a middle school science teacher for Atlanta Public Schools. And throughout the 23 years, I've worked with a variety of districts as well as nonprofits. And pumpkin spice, it's a no for me in terms of the drink, but I like the smell a lot. So I do have pumpkin spice candles in my house. So hopefully no one has a bias against me now because of my choice. Thank you. Karina, pass it over to you.
Thanks, Diane. I'm Karina Ramos. I'm a recruitment consultant here at Agility. I've been here for a little over 2 years, and before that, I was a middle school and high school teacher here in DC. And as far as pumpkin spice, I also am not a fan, but some of these responses are making me think I need to try something new.
Okay, so some of you may not be very familiar with us at Agility, so I wanted to start off by just introducing Agility, kind of who we are, what we do, why we do it. So starting with what we do. So what you're seeing on the slides are the three broad buckets of our talent equity work. So we empower our clients by enabling them to live out their equity and social justice values. And we do this by helping them to run equitable talent searches that place diverse leaders in the right roles, creating transparent compensation programs, ensuring that programs are implemented consistently, and building equitable talent practices and systems across organizations. So we're really intentional about structuring our work that we do with clients to improve the capacity of the organizations that we work with so that they can achieve their mission. So next, why we do what we do. So creating a new standard for the way that social justice organizations hire, value, and grow their talent is what really motivates us. And we believe the more organizations that adopt equitable hiring, compensation, and talent management practices, the more it will become what talent expects and demands. And this begins to pave the way towards systemic change. So this movement to ensure that all people, regardless of their identity, have what they need to succeed in the workplace is helping to close wage gaps as well as opportunity gaps. And in doing so is changing the face of leadership to more accurately reflect the communities that many of our organizations serve.
Great. So here's our agenda for today's webinar. To start, we do want to name in the registration form that you all completed. A lot of you mentioned that you've taken some sort of training like this before. And today's session will really be an introduction to anti-bias training. So kind of like an anti-bias 101. If this is your first time taking anti-bias training, welcome. We're really happy that you're here with us. But if you're a part of an organization that's further along in their equity journey, then this session is really going to help you to have the tools you need to share with hiring managers, especially before interviews, to make sure that these concepts that they're likely already familiar with are top of mind as they go into the interviews, and to really create the space that they need to be able to discuss these topics. So today's session is a great introduction to anti-bias training, and there are certainly more levels to it. Our goal for today is for you to understand what bias is, how to identify and mitigate against it, and you can leave our session today with information on how to make those initial changes to your organization's hiring process to make it more equitable. So we're going to do that by unpacking bias, defining it and its role in hiring, and leveraging competency assessments. We'll go through some examples so that you have some examples through case studies, and then at the end we'll save some time for any questions that you have about your organization.
Okay, so first, going into unpacking bias, we're going to open with a brief clip from a TED Talk. And so what I want you to do over the next 4 minutes that we watch is listen carefully to what is said about the danger of having a single story. And then afterwards, we're going to get your thoughts on how this relates to bias in the hiring process.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow, we ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination, they opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this: it saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them.
Okay. Okay. So in the TED Talk, it's explored how assumptions can lead us to infer incomplete narratives. So now we want to hear from you in the chat. So based on what you've heard and also your own experience, how might the danger of a single story be harmful in the context of hiring? And we'll give you a couple of seconds to put your responses in the chat. Yeah, exactly. So we're seeing some responses come in, and there's a lot of responses about assumptions and how when we make assumptions, we're actually missing out on some great candidates for a variety of reasons. We're not asking questions because we feel like we already have the answers. Is something else that I see? We're not seeing the whole person. All of these are 100% spot on. So in the hiring process, it is so critical that we assess a candidate as a whole and not just let a single story influence our decisions. And so over the course of the rest of the webinar, we're going to be talking more about that, as well as discussing some examples.
Great. So for this next part, we are going to participate in an activity. We need you to participate and be engaged in order for it to work. So although I can't hear everyone, I am trusting that you all are doing this out loud in your spaces. So you're going to see 3 columns. All you have to do is, as quickly as possible, run down the columns and ignore the letters, shout out the colors. So just so we all know too, we actually got this activity from a TED Talk by Jerry Kang called Immaculate Perception. So if you haven't seen the TED Talk, we definitely recommend that you watch it at some point. Let's look at the next slide, and I'll do the first column so you all see what I'm talking about. So for this first column, I would say blue, yellow, red, green. So you all are going to shout out the colors that you see in columns 2 and 3 as quickly as you can, ignoring the words, just shouting out the colors. Ready, set, go. Great. So we're going to do it again. Ignore the words, just shout out the colors. Ready, set, go. Great. One more time. You're shouting out the colors and ignoring the words. Ready, set, go. Thanks, Diane. So obviously I couldn't hear all of you, but my assumption is that this last slide, it was a little bit trickier to get through and naming all the colors. And that's because when we have 2 concepts tightly associated in our brains, it's really quick to make that association. So if we see the word yellow and the color yellow, we can associate that quickly. Our brain knows they go together. When we try to separate that, it can be a little more challenging. So with that in mind, we're going to ask you a couple questions. So first, what does this activity make you think about in terms of how our implicit biases might impact the way we assess candidates? And how can we distinguish between implicit and explicit bias? Feel free to enter your response in the chat. The biases are quick. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great, Dominique. You have to be intentional about pausing. Definitely. Mm-hmm. You have to slow down. Yep. Mm-hmm. Those are great responses. Thank you all. So yeah, just to answer the implicit and explicit. Explicit is something that we're more aware of. So our implicit biases are things that are just those tight associations in our brain. And we really have to work to break them apart. And then they can be explicit biases, things that we're more aware of. Thank you for that. That was really helpful.
Okay. So as we saw in the last activity, and I love that someone put that last slide was rough. Yes, I was also on the struggle bus. Y'all probably saw me trying to say the color and not the word. So everyone has bias. This is something that cannot be ignored. It cannot be eliminated, but we can become more aware. And that awareness helps us to mitigate against bias to ensure that our decisions are fair as well as equitable. Okay, so this may look a little familiar, not in this format, but we're going to talk about some ways that bias can manifest itself in the hiring process. And so when you registered, we asked you kind of a trick question of where do you think bias is most prevalent in the hiring process? And we named these 4 areas. And someone did say, this is a trick question because it's prevalent everywhere. And that's true. It is. And so I'm going to go through each of these areas, and then we'll also explore them in a little bit more detail later. So at the beginning of the process, we had the resume review. And so you can tend to focus on irrelevant assets such as education if it's not required. So if someone needs a bachelor's degree for a role, but you see that they have a master's or PhD, you may become fixated on that, even though it's not required for the role, it's irrelevant, or a previous job title that may not be relevant, or where they went to school. So these are all things that we can see in the resume where bias can seep in based on what we see for a variety of reasons. The next stage in the process, the initial interview. So some of you may do video interviews or phone interviews with candidates before they come to an in-person finalist interview. And so during those times, it's easy to be swayed by what we call affinity bias, which we'll learn about more a little later, as well as friendliness factor or someone's ability to persuade. This is where I say, it is really easy to kind of lean into someone's charisma, but we want you to pull back on that and actually listen to their content, right? But it's very easy to be swayed in those areas in the initial interview. And then at the finalist interview stage, we can have a tendency to rely on others' perceptions because in a lot of processes that you all may have, the finalist interview may be where you have others involved in the process. And so we can see things like groupthink, or even trying to think about how others may perceive someone during that process, or tunnel vision or confirmation bias. And then during the references, reliance on informal or backdoor references, which we'll talk about a little later, or pushing much harder on some candidates' references versus other candidates' references. So these are ways that we have definitely seen bias show up at different stages of the process. And so how can you combat this? And again, we'll go into a little bit more detail, but here are just a couple of ways that you can combat this in the hiring process. So building awareness of bias and developing systems to check yourself. So the information in this webinar is a great example. This is a great intro, as Karina said, where you are just illuminating to hiring managers that, hey, we all have biases. The 2 activities that we did at the beginning of this webinar are 2 great ways to introduce that information in a way that can be very comfortable to begin the conversation. And then also leveraging a competency model or rubrics to accurately assess candidates during the hiring process. And we'll talk about this a little later, but making sure that you have a tool that you're using to assess candidates that is based on competencies and skills that are needed for the role. So that gives an opportunity, less of an opportunity for bias to seep into the process.
Great. So there are a lot of biases that come up when we are going through hiring processes. These are 10 of the most common ones. And Dana, if you click through, you'll see the names for all the pictures. But we are going to share a poll. If there are names that or biases that you're familiar with already, then feel free to ignore those in the poll, but you're selecting the ones that you are least familiar with in the poll. And then we'll go over the definitions for those after you all have had a moment to look through them.
And some fantastic participation here on with this poll. Please keep the answers coming. We'll keep it up for just about another couple seconds here. Fantastic. Thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and end this poll, and then we'll be able to see everyone's responses here. Okay, there we go.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you all for participating. It sounds like Head in the Clouds is the one we're least familiar with. So that one is actually when you're swayed by insubstantial evaluation. So if someone says something like, oh, this candidate kind of fell flat for me, I can't put a finger on it, but something about that candidate didn't land correctly. So that's would be an example of Head in the Clouds, just because there's not any substantial evidence there of what it was. You really want to drill down on what exactly it is that the candidate is missing based on the competencies that you have decided were most important for the role. I can't remember what the second one was. Dan, do you remember?
The second one was irrelevant assets.
Okay. So that one's similar to In the Clouds too. So being swayed by positive attributes outside of the competency areas. So instead of focusing on the competency itself, something like, oh, they were really knocked out this program role. They were really great at something that's not in the competency. So it's the opposite of In the Clouds, and you're really focusing on the positive things that they said that weren't relevant to the experiences that you're looking for. And then the third one was halo effect. This one is again similar, but it's really admiring a person's actions because of something they've done that's praiseworthy in the past. So maybe you had one really positive interaction with this person, and that's outweighing everything else in their interview process. So because of that one positive interaction, you're putting a lot of weight on that and just not thinking about the rest. And one that's not on here, but it's actually the opposite of halo effect, would be horn effect, which is exactly the flip. So you had one negative interaction and you're letting that overpower the rest of the interactions you're having with this candidate. So thank you all. Thank you all for sharing. We are going to provide you with definitions for all of these biases. So in the next slide, we have a QR code. So you can scan this QR code, and the link is also in the chat, and you'll get a worksheet with the definition for all those 10 common types of biases that come up during hiring. This is a great tool to use with hiring managers as well, and just for you to have top of mind before you're interviewing candidates. So take a moment to look through that, and then just reflect a little bit. We'd love to have you respond in the chat, or just think to yourself, which of these biases have you experienced either as a candidate or as an interviewer, and what bias are you most prone to exhibit? I think having that awareness of what it is that you are most prone to do during an interview allows you to kind of mitigate that a little bit better. So for me, for example, I know that affinity bias is something that I'm prone to. If I see a first generation American Latina applying for something, I get really excited, but just the awareness allows me to mitigate against that a little bit and remind myself I have to look at their experiences and their skills aligned to the rubric. So if you all are feeling like sharing, definitely share in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Sounds like I'm not alone in my affinity bias. Friendliness, yep. Yeah, groupthink is one too. Thank you, Nora. That one can be tricky if so many people in the group are saying something and you disagree. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Great. I appreciate the vulnerability here and sharing. Like I said, I think just being aware that this is something you're prone to really helps to mitigate it as you go into interviews. Awesome. So we're going to go through each stage, well, typical stages of hiring processes. Your process might be different. And what are the common biases that come up during that stage, and how you can combat them? So initially, when you're reviewing resumes, it's easy to focus on irrelevant assets. So maybe this person has a degree that looks nice, or went to the same school as you, or has a role that sounds really important. But that might not be relevant to the role that you're hiring for. So it's important to concentrate on the skills and experience that relate right to the competencies that you said were most important when you started the searching for this role. And if there's anything that you're unsure of when you're looking at a resume, following up with candidates. So you can schedule a quick 10 to 15-minute call with them and have them clear up anything that isn't clear on their resume, so that you can, be sure that they have those skills and experiences, or don't have those skills and experiences, before you automatically reject them. And then the next stage might be a video or phone interview that you do with candidates. In this case, this would be the first time you're seeing them or hearing them. So it would be easy to be swayed with affinity bias, friendliness factor, which a lot of you mentioned in the chat. So thank you for that. And again, it's important to ask questions that are directly related to their skills and experience, and really listen to the content of what they're saying instead of how they're saying it.
So then the next stage may be a committee interview or a finalist interview. And so common biases that we see here are affinity bias and tendency to rely on others' perceptions. So this is where groupthink has a tendency to come in. And groupthink may be really strong, also depending on the power dynamic of the group, of the committee. As well. So that's something to think about. And tunnel vision can come in here as well. So narrowly focusing on a couple of traits versus the whole person, as well as confirmation bias. So based on what you saw in the previous rounds of your process, asking questions to confirm what you already think about that person, as opposed to making sure that the questions that you ask are really based on the competencies and skills needed for the role. So strategies to combat, again, we keep discussing utilizing a standard set of competency aligned questions with all candidates to ensure equity, also considering the whole person and evaluating their skills, and refraining from discussing candidates with others until everyone has submitted their individual ratings or scores. So this is something that we do with clients, is before we have a debrief after a committee interview and a finalist interview round, we have everyone submit ratings individually first, and then that is where we begin our debrief, because then everyone gets their individual opinions, questions, feedback out first, without having to think about or consider everyone else's opinions, and we can start the conversation from there. And also definitely this fall during a finalist interview that's in person, don't put out pumpkin spice, because we don't want to make sure that you don't want to introduce bias there early on for the candidates to see if they choose it or not. And then the references. So common biases that we see come up there are relying on informal or backdoor references. This is so important, and this comes up a lot, and it can be seen as human nature, but a backdoor reference is when you may know someone who worked with the person that you're interviewing, and you just ask them questions about that. Please do not do that. One, you don't know if this person has shared that they're looking for a new position. So you're breaching confidentiality and sharing that. Also, you don't want to do that because recognize that that person may have known them during one specific point in time. And so that may not be relevant to the role that you are hiring them for at all. So you want to make sure that you ask the candidates to provide references. And if there's someone who you feel may be missing, then you can say, hey, we would also like to get a reference from someone who you worked with at this place, right? So that you can still get that type of feedback, or from someone who you managed, so you can still get that that feedback in a transparent and equitable way. Also, what comes in during that stage is perception and confirmation bias can come in during the reference stage. Ways to combat: so create a standard list of questions for all of your candidates that you ask the references, unless there are very particular probes. So we're not saying don't probe. Probing is important, but make sure you have your standard questions and that you're probing based on what you hear, and that your probing is balanced between candidates, right? And you're not just probing for one and not probing for another. And contact the same number of people for each candidate. I know this may sound like a no-brainer, but we have certainly seen situations where this has not been the case, where there have been 2 finalists, you know, someone may want 3 references for one and then may want 10 for another. And I'm exaggerating here, but we want to make sure that you're speaking to the same number of people, and preferably the same types of people. So maybe someone who managed them, someone they managed if it's a management role that they're going into, and a colleague. But you want to make sure that things are as similar across the board as possible. And here's the slide that talks about what I was just talking about. So something that we have talked about a lot is competency assessment. So saying that ideally you would have a competency rubric. Well, how do you get that information? What we suggest, and we do with our clients, is we conduct a discovery process to understand what competencies are needed for the role. So we schedule a meeting with clients to determine who are the key stakeholders who we should speak with, to find out from them what is really important for this person in the role. We find out about the culture of the team. We find out about the skills needed, the ideal experiences, the competencies. And then we work with the client to put together a rubric at the beginning of the process in order to determine what are we going to assess candidates against at every stage of the process. And here are some strategies for launching your own discovery process. So one, holding a kickoff call to find out who the key decision makers are. You find out from the hiring manager. So who should be included in this discovery process, and asking them, how do they want you to engage with them? Do they want you to have one-on-one conversations with them, focus groups? Is a survey okay? How do they want you to engage? Number 2, ensure that you have context to revise the job description and develop a competency rubric for the role that is based on organization and staff needs. So during this discovery process, you're really going to hone in on what are the needs of the team, what are the needs of the organization. Even though you may work for the organization as a whole, you may not be as clear on what the exact team dynamics are. And so you want to make sure that you're getting that information so that you can tweak the job description and also create the competency rubric. And then check back with the decision maker on the discovery findings to let them know what you heard, and tweak the job description if needed, and then create the competency rubric. Okay, so this competency rubric that we keep talking about. So one of the best ways to mitigate against biases is to ground decision-making in clear criteria to ensure consistency and fairness. And so what you see on this slide is just an example of some general competencies that you may have for a role. So mission and vision alignment, that's really, really important for a lot of organizations. Equity leadership is also something that can be really important for organizations. People leadership, particularly if this is a role where someone will be managing others. And then depending on the role, there may be school leadership experiences that you want this person to have, or maybe you want them to have a different type of leadership. But you want to make sure that you're really honing in on what are the experiences, what are the years of experiences that they may need in a particular area? What are the management experience if that's necessary for the role? So what is really needed for this person to be successful in the role? So what came up during your registration is a lot of you wanted to know, how do you support hiring managers with this, and how do you get hiring managers on board? You may be on board, but you're concerned whether or not your hiring managers may be. And so here are some strategies for supporting hiring managers in this process. One is providing a training. And as we mentioned earlier on, you can intro that training in a way that that is really approachable by using some of the resources and tools that we use during this training. So the TED Talks, the activity that Karina went through, the cheat sheet that you'll have access to, you'll want to make sure that you just either reintroduce them to these biases or introduce them to these biases in a way that is very comfortable, and also that you provide refreshers. So people are going to forget, particularly if they're not using it right away. And so you can record your trainings if you're doing this over Zoom, so that they can watch again right before they start interviewing a candidate, or you can have some quick refresher that you do for them right before they start interviewing candidates, so that the information is fresh. You want to work with them on diversifying their interview panel. So in terms of interview panels, diversity can mean more than race, gender, etc. Maybe they want to have someone on the panel who works closely with the department, but is not in that department, because that person also brings in another perspective that may not be something that is in their lens. So how are they making sure that the panel itself is diverse in a variety of ways, so that the whole candidate is considered in the process? Surveying candidates to provide data to hiring managers about the process and how the process went for them and felt for them. Hard data is something that a lot of times people do respond to, and that way the information is coming from the candidates and not just from you. And then aligning your ask to the organization's goals and priorities. A lot of organizations have goals and priorities related to DEIB, and so you're aligning your process so that it is a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive process.
Great. So we're going to look at a couple of examples, and we'd love for you to, after we look at each example, answer these questions in the chat. So what biases are you seeing happening in the scenario, and why? And what would you use to mitigate against those biases? So this first example is Luisa. She is interviewing for a teacher role. The hiring manager finds Luisa to be extremely friendly during her interview and marks her high for approachability and people skills. In addition to this, the hiring manager notices that Luisa also received her master's from the same school and is positive that she's qualified for the role. However, the listing for the teacher role says that only a bachelor's is required. So with this example, what biases do you see happening? Why do you think they're happening? And what would you do to mitigate against that? Great, thank you for those responses. We can look at the answers. Great, that's right, Emma. So you all named some other biases, but that are definitely right as well. But the three that we named were affinity bias, friendliness effect, and confirmation bias. So in this case, the hiring manager has a bias towards Luisa because she attends the same grad program, but that's not a requirement for the role. She also praised Lisa's approachability based on her likable personality rather than assessing her actual people skills. This came through in the chat a couple times. Just how do we, manage if someone's a fit? I saw a question about preschool teachers needing to be friendly. There's definitely a way to word that in a rubric that doesn't just say friendliness or approachability. How do you define friendliness? What does it mean to be approachable? What are those skills that they need in order to be able to effectively talk to parents, talk to students in a way that a preschool teacher would be expected to? So you can't quite rate friendliness or approachability. That's not something that should be on your rubric, but there are other ways to make sure that they are mission aligned, that they have skills and experience that you need to be a preschool teacher, for example. Great. How do you define X? Thank you for that. That's really helpful in the chat. So being able to name it, share examples, and then using that wording in a rubric. Great. We have one more example. Do we have time for the second example?
We have a little bit of time. I think we could probably run through it. Yeah.
Okay, great. So for Eli has made it to the final round and he's met most of the competency requirements. The CEO feels that they should relaunch the search process because he believes that they can find a candidate who meets all of the competency requirements. The rest of the hiring committee feels otherwise. Eli is a great candidate and the search process has been costly to relaunch. The hiring team is swayed by the CEO and reluctantly agrees to relaunch the search. So which biases do we see in effect here? And what can we do to mitigate against them? I'm seeing groupthink, great, tunnel vision, power dynamic. What can we do to mitigate against those biases? Those are great responses, everyone. Thank you. Awesome. So those are the two that we named too. There's definitely groupthink happening here. Everyone just agreeing, and especially because the person who is suggesting this is someone who's in a position of power, then that kind of shifts the dynamic a little bit, and you're swayed by a fear, really, of not agreeing with the person who's in power. So a great way to mitigate against this is by establishing a good enough bar. So which of the competencies that you've listed as important are absolutely non-negotiable? You might have 6 or 7 competencies, and like Eli, there are candidates who are not going to be able to be a 5 out of 5 in every single competency. So which ones are non-negotiable? Do you definitely need them to meet? And which ones are you able to have someone who's maybe a 3 out of 5 or a 4 out of 5, and you can work with them and train them on those competencies? So really deciding what that is before you get to the finalist round so that you can avoid a situation like this one. Great. So I think we can transition to Q&A now.
Yes. We have gotten so many amazing questions, and I really appreciate everyone sending in their questions and really thinking critically about these things. We do only have just a bit over 10 minutes here, so I'm going to try to make sure that we can get through most of these questions. So some of the questions that we've gotten, and I think, Karina, you kind of touched on this in your most recent piece here, but it was basically going to ask about, what do you do when you have a senior who isn't, someone who's a higher level leadership, really insisting on only hiring for a fit, which takes a number of people out of the running for the position. And I think we kind of talked a little bit about this, but could you give just a couple of concrete examples of how to combat this, kind of maybe even before you get to this situation?
I can share. I think definitely defining what does it mean to be a fit? What are the examples? How do you define that? Is it mission alignment? Do they just need to be on board with what your organization's trying to do? And if so, does that mean that they've worked with other organizations that are similar to yours? What kinds of experience are you looking for to define that they're a fit? I don't know if you would add anything else, Diane.
Yeah, exactly. Being very clear, getting very clear and aligned as a committee. What does that mean? And that should not be the only thing that is in your competency rubric, right? So if early on you establish this is the competency rubric that we are using to vet candidates against, and the way that we developed it was through this discovery process where we spoke to stakeholders to find out what is really important for this person to be successful in this role. The only thing, fit is not going to be the only thing there, and each of the competencies you need to define. And then early on, as Karina said, you want to make sure that you weigh each area properly and decide on what that's going to be ahead of time. So this all goes into the work that you put in on the front end in determining that competency rubric and how it's going to be used, so that when you have the conversation later on, you know, it's not just you, it's everyone else on the hiring committee too that's holding, you all are each holding each other accountable to say, wait a minute, yes, they scored let's say 4 in how you're defining fit, but in these other areas that we say are also important, this is where they land. And so overall, this candidate as a whole may or may not be the right person for this role.
Thank you for that, Diane and Karina. A couple of the other questions that we're getting, I think we've seen them before, and this is specifically about a list of references. So we have a question about, what if a potential hire provides a list of references and expresses not to contact some of them? What are the hiring manager's boundaries here, or how do you deal with that? Also in line with that is kind of, what do you do? Is there a sweet spot of having a backdoor reference versus like a reference that a candidate has selected that will give them maybe a glowing review?
I think most candidates are going to select people for their references that are going to give them a positive reference. That's why they selected them, right? But if you have reason to be concerned, you can ask them, hey, I would love for a reference from this particular organization that you worked for. Do you have a reference from that organization? So you can be very specific in the references that you want in terms of from which role, whether or not it is a former manager, if it's someone who they managed, if it's just a colleague, etc. And still also give them the flexibility in telling you who they want you to talk to. In terms of the first question about references, refresh my memory on that question, Dane, about the first question you asked about references.
Yeah, so basically the question is, you know, if they say that they provide you a list of references, but they tell you not to contact some of them, what are the hiring manager's boundaries for this?
I think being clear with candidates on when references will be checked. Part of the reason that candidates may say that is because they have not disclosed, for a variety of reasons, that they're looking for a new opportunity. And there could be a variety of reasons, again, that they are doing this. And so letting them know when references will be checked will be very important to do. And also having a conversation with them about maybe you don't check the references until you know that this person is getting an offer, right? I've certainly had conversations with candidates about that for certain roles where they say, hey, here are my references, but please don't reach out to them unless I'm getting an offer, which can make sense for a variety of reasons. Karina, do you have anything to add there?
I think the only piece that I would add is, if you're reaching out to, say, a supervisor, a colleague, a direct report, you have to make sure you're reaching out to the same amount and the same level for each candidate. So if you're doing references for more than one candidate, just making sure they all get the same number of calls and the same relationship as well.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. So this next question is something I think we've seen a lot of, and it has to do with, I think, some maybe standards that many people have come to expect in regards to hiring in the interview process. So basically, how would someone move past their bias for people who show up to an interview, whether in person or remote, in business attire, and also send a follow-up note? How do you suggest that they move past that?
You
I was
unmuted,
just gonna
Karina, did
say,
you?
no, I was just gonna say to start, like knowing that that's a bias you have is a great place to start. So just being aware of it allows you to have a little bit more control of it.
And staying on top of trends in the field, right? So also understanding that some of these things are generational. I hate to say it, but some things are. So the thank you note, whether it's, I grew up in a day where it was handwritten, right? And you would leave it or you would send it after. There could be folks who email it, or there could be folks who don't write one at all, or who text it. So and also attire, that's also relative to, and also can be generational and regional, etc. So again, as Karina said, recognizing that that's a bias, and really understanding, is this really relevant to this particular role, right? Is this enough to influence whether or not this is the right fit? This person is the right fit for this particular role. In most cases, it's not. So being aware and kind of checking that, and also letting other people on your committee know that this is a bias that you may have, so that they can help you with that as well.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for probably one more question. So the question that came in is, my org does a great job identifying and defining competencies, which are then rated 1 through 5. However, it feels like the in the clouds bias happens when interviewers rate a 2 versus 3 or 3 versus 4. Do we in human resources need to specifically define what each number rating entails to avoid this?
I think it makes sense to have some type of norming on the ratings. So earlier on, when you establish the rubric, have some type of norming. But then that's also going to come up in your debrief conversation. And that's when you just ask probing questions, because it's very easy to let in the clouds hang in the clouds. So now that you know what it is, and you know that someone is saying, oh, I can't really put my finger on it. Okay, well, can we please try to relate it back to the competency? Was there something that they said? Was there something in the performance task, right? To really nail down where they fall on this competency. Also, you'll want to average the ratings. What I do sometimes too, which is why it's so helpful to have people do it individually. We show them during the debrief the individual ratings, and I will say, well, one person put this person as a 2 and another person put this person as a 5. There is, there's not alignment here. Let's discuss that. And really using that opportunity to have a robust conversation about that person and come to where that person actually falls.
Perfect. And one last question before we get in, is there a certain number of competencies you recommend for a rubric? Like a bare minimum or a maximum?
I've seen probably about, I don't know, maybe like 8. What have you seen, Karina? I saw that question, so I was looking through.
Yeah, I would say 5 to 8 at most, just because then it gets a little hard to collect so much evidence. So just really, and you have to prioritize which ones are the non-negotiables and which ones you're okay with having people not be a 5 out of 5. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, everyone, I think we are coming here at time. And I just want to say thank you all so much for joining us for this session. This was kind of our 1.0 version of disrupting bias in hiring. So you can go ahead and answer, if you can take a moment to go through our survey. You can let us know what you would like to know in a follow-up session if we were to do a second one on this. And then also, if you have more questions that were not answered here, please feel free to use Diane's Calendly link and book a session with her. And then just a reminder, I will be sending out the recording as well as all of the resources that we talked about to kind of help you combat this in your organization. So again, thank you all so much for joining us today. This is really, really important work. So thank you for joining us on this and being a part of this journey. So thank you all. Take good care and we'll see you again soon.